Begin. So, Journey of the Soul, Lesson 2. Last week we discussed exactly what life and death is according to Jewish tradition and how that actually affects our day-to-day life as we go through the trials and tribulations, the challenges that we meet, the blessings, and the opposite as we go through life, how that affects us and what we should do about it. Today, we are moving on to a slightly more sensitive and emotional subject, but very important. And may I say, even with a number of beautiful and inspiring aspects as we go through the class. And the second class will be really discussing the continuing connection that we maintain with the deceased and vice versa. And so running through today's class, just a general overview, we're going to be discussing the spiritual significance of a person's passing, the process of the soul's departure from the body. We'll examine the Jewish traditions that ensure the care and really reverence of the deceased and its interment. And we will discuss the idea of grave visitation and what it helps and what we are accomplishing. And so what we'll begin with the idea that, as we discussed last week, the soul's departure is not so much the end of life as much as it is a beginning of a new phase. This beginning of the new phase really is the idea that the soul is no longer tethered. It's no longer constrained under the constraints of the physical body. It is now ready to roam freely amongst the spiritual realms, the realms of which we will actually discuss in subsequent classes, the exact realms of which the soul is now roaming. But we'll begin with an interesting letter that will really set the tone for the entirety of the class. This letter was a letter penned by the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, in 1788. And it was penned to the followers of a contemporary Hasidic sage, Rebbe, whose name was Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Hardach, who at that point actually had traveled from Russia to Israel to lead the Jewish community, the Hasidic Jewish community in Israel. Now, in Israel, there weren't that many rabbis, as many as there were in Europe and in Eastern Europe, as well as Hasidic rabbis were very few. And so when the great sage Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Hardach passed, there was a tremendous void and sense of mourning and grief amongst his followers. And so the Alter Rebbe, in an attempt to comfort the mourners and comfort the students and Hasidim of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Hardach, penned this letter. And this letter will give us a very powerful insight to the entirety of tonight's topic. Before we begin, I'd like to once again share screen. Just a moment. There we go. Before we begin, I'd like to once again thank the sponsors of tonight's class. It's made possible by Dr. David and Brigitte Kalmanson. Thank you very much for tonight's sponsorship in honor of your children and grandchildren. May you see much Yiddish and Hasidish nachas from them and from all of them, as well as Mr. Robert and Ruben in memory of Robert's parents, Bernie and Muriel Ruben. So thank you very much. May you be blessed with good health and happiness. Yes, you do have a letter. We're going to get to that in a moment. And so we begin with this powerful lesson, this powerful letter, which is on page 43. But before we get to the letter, I'd like to give an introduction. And that is, to understand this letter, we'd like to introduce two Kabbalistic terms that we'll be employing and discussing in this letter. Those are the terms of ruach and nefesh. You see, the soul, when we discuss the soul, we're referring to the general soul, the neshama, as it's referred to in Hebrew, when referred to the entirety of the soul. But really, the soul is comprised of 5 dimensions. Incidentally, which is we'll get to at a later class, that is the reason why it's customary, as you may have seen, to light 5 candles for a departed soul during the first year after the soul's passing. when the Kaddish is said, and various other times there are 5 candles that are lit. Those are for the 5 dimensions of the soul. But for tonight's discussion, we're going to focus on the 2 dimensions, the lowest 2 dimensions of the soul, namely Ruach and Nefesh. And you see, you have it on page 42 in your books, figure 2.1, which explains these 2 components of the soul that are manifest within the human body. The difference between the 2 is as follows. Nefesh is the soul component that, although it is spiritual, it's the component that provides physical life and empowers all bodily functions of the human. It's the spiritual engine, if you will, of the animating force of the body. The Ruach, on the other hand, is the part of the soul that drives our emotions and feelings. And so it's not only spiritual in and of itself, but it also drives our spiritual aspect, our feelings and emotions. The higher level of the soul, the higher component of the soul, is that of the neshama, which is a more specific expression of the topic of the word neshama, referencing that middle level of the soul, which is associated with the intellect, that we will not delve upon. So we're just going to focus on the nefesh and the ruach. The ruach component of the soul, it enables emotions, it's the feelings, and once the soul departs from the body after one's passing, the ruach ascends to the heaven, to its source, its divine source. Whereas the nefesh, that lowest nefesh component of the soul, the one that's associated and enables a physical and biological life, that aspect of the soul remains in the grave, it remains with the body following the passing of the individual. And with that introduction, we're going to read the letter from the Alter Rebbe in 1788 to his disciples. Text 1a. As is known, the life of the tzaddik, righteous person, is not physical, but spiritual. It consists of faith, reverence, and love for God. During the tzaddik's lifetime on earth, these 3 attributes that belong to the soul dimension of Ruach are constrained within their container and garb, namely the nefesh that is bound to the corporeal body. This imposes the restraints of physical space upon these attributes. As a result, all the tzaddik's disciples received but a glow of these ruach attributes, a mere ray that is emitted beyond the container by means of the tzaddik's holy words and thoughts. The inability to receive directly from ruach is a revelatory handicap, and therefore our sages stated that it takes 40 years for students to fully plumb the depths of their master's teaching. By contrast, after the tzaddik's passing, the nefesh separates from the ruach and remains in the grave while the ruach and its 3 attributes rise to Gan Eden, to heaven. Consequently, when whoever is close to the tzaddik can receive directly from his ruach in Gan Eden, because the ruach is no longer restrained in a container or confined to his physical space. There is now a straightforward path for the tzaddik's disciples to connect with the essence of their master's ruach, the faith, awe, and love with which the tzaddik served God. And not merely these attributes' outer glow that escape beyond their container. The disciples connect and receive commensurate to their degree of their loving connection and closeness to the tzaddik during his lifetime and after his death. For the transmission of all things spiritual is always by means of great love. You see, what the Alter Rebbe is explaining here is a very powerful concept. That is, this idea that at one's passing, the ruach separates from the nefesh and ascends on high, but the nefesh is left in the body. The ruach in the life of a tzaddik, and really each one of us has the tzaddik, the righteous one within, because we all have the ruach component to us. And so this spiritual aspect, this soul, the soul within us, is limited in its expression because it's a divine soul, it's a spiritual soul. And it's free to express itself, its essence, when it isn't constrained in the limited, finite physical body. And so a tzaddik who has many disciples who are attempting to tap into his spiritual side is limited with his effect on his disciples because his soul is limited within the constraints of a finite body. Once those constraints are removed, the soul can now fly freely. It's able to express itself, it's able to express its essence to its fullest. And so the disciples, in this narrow application to this concept, are now able to tap into that infinite depth and beauty of the soul. And so now that spiritual connection between the soul and its loved ones is deeper than ever before. This spiritual connection, which is much deeper now that it is untethered and free of its constraints of the finite body, is not only a freedom for the loved ones to tap into the relationship with the soul, but it's also free for the soul to express its feelings, which until now were limited to mere expressions, revealed aspects of its essence, and now it is able to express its very essence, now that it isn't limited by the body in and of itself. And I'll give you an example. We may not all be techie, but I think it's an example we can all relate to. When watching a video, a movie back in the 60s, in the 70s, or even in the 90s, we'd go to Blockbuster, rent a movie, put it in the it was a VHS, put it into the player, and we saw a movie which was whatever the movie was. We'd see a somewhat grainy picture. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't amazing. The sounds may have been a little cracky, especially if someone else rented that VHS before us a number of times. And then as the years progressed, throughout the past 20 years, it has gotten much better. First, it moved to DVDs, which were nice, sharper picture, better sounds. And then it moved from DVDs to 720 DPI, which enabled us to see an even better picture, an even sharper sound. And we needed to upgrade our screens. And then we moved to 1080 DPI, which was even sharper. And then we moved to 4K, and now we're holding at 8K, and it's constantly growing, and it's sharper, high definition, super high definition, ultra high definition. The tech companies are making lots of money by changing it fast and furious. What happens if you take a video, a movie, that's supposed to be played on ultra high definition, super sharp picture, wide flat screen, beautiful sounds, it's vivid, it's almost like you're there, and you play it on a screen from the 90s. It's missing. It's not able to express its full essence. Yes, you're watching the movie, whatever it is, but it's grainy, sound isn't great. Once you enable it to be in a receptacle that it's able to tap into, now the receiver is able to express its fullest. A similar concept is with the soul. Now the soul is able to be set free. It's able to tap into its true essence, how it was created, what it was created for. And we'll read text 1b, where the Rebbe explains this idea from the soul's perspective. Leah, would you like to read text 1b on page 45? You have to unmute yourself first.
1b. It is also a matter of common sense that whatever the direct cause of the separation of the soul from the body, whether a fatal accident or a fatal illness, etc., it could affect only any of the vital organs of the physical body, but could in no way affect the spiritual soul. Keep going?
Keep going.
Okay, perfect. A further point, which is also understandable, is that during the soul's lifetime on earth, in partnership with the body, the soul is necessarily handicapped in certain respects by the requirements of the body, such as eating and drinking. Even a tzaddik whose entire life is consecrated to Hashem cannot escape the restraints of life in a material and physical environment. Consequently, when the time comes for the soul to return home, it is essentially a release for it as it makes its ascent to a higher world, no longer restrained by a physical body and a physical environment. Henceforth, the soul is free to enjoy the spiritual bliss of being nearer to Hashem in the furthest measure.
Thank you. So now we understand the idea that our souls are set free. One soul is set free once it isn't in the constraints of the physical body. And I'd like to share with you the class video, which will, the lesson video, which will give us another metaphor and to enable us to understand this concept a little bit better.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear? That's what psychologists call inattentional blindness. And no, it is not a condition to be concerned about. In fact, life would be impossible without it. Let me explain. As powerful as the human brain may be, it is easily overwhelmed by the sheer onslaught of observation, calculation, sight, sound, and signals that envelop our every waking hour. The brain cannot permit itself to register and record each image and movement, every message and stimulation. Instead, our brains and nervous systems aggressively filter and limit our intake to manageable levels. The result? We notice a fraction and ignore the fullness and remember far less. Often, we purposely engage in what cognitive neuroscientists call selective attention, like focusing on a dinner partner in a crowded restaurant, while tuning out all other conversations in the room. Now imagine that you had the ability to absorb everything around you, to absorb, comprehend, and recall all the details, and fetch every memory at will, without being overwhelmed. That is the incredible experience of the human soul, once it detaches from the body at the close of a lifetime. Unshackled from the frailties of a nervous system, unrestricted by networks of neurons, it is unbelievably free and powerfully present. It is free to absorb truths that mortal minds cannot contain, present to delight in the divine radiance that courses through the cosmos, to bask in divine understanding that supersedes human senses, but is savored by the newly liberated soul.
So this explains why on a mystical level, the moment of a person's passing is highly significant. At that moment, all the person's spiritual energy is unleashed. It's not tethered to its material self. and it's revealed to itself and to its loved ones, and to those it was connected to throughout its life. All our holy and beautiful ideals, feelings, emotions, principles, they're all rooted in the Ruach, in this greater level of the soul. And so when one passes, these ideals, feelings, and principles, they don't vanish. On the contrary, they become more intensified, and they're greatly accessible to all the soul's loved ones and those that seek to connect to that person at that time. How do we connect to that person? As we quoted at the end of text 1a, the more we love, the more we show love, the more we can connect with them. And the more we connect, and when we connect, we're connecting with the deepest aspect of our love. This may explain why, after one's passing, especially as the years progress, we seem to remember their great qualities. And we don't necessarily remember or focus on their negative qualities. We tend to have a greater appreciation for people after their passing and their noble qualities. So obviously it can't be denied that there are practical reasons for this. Distance makes the heart grow fonder. It's been a long time. We'd rather not remember the negative aspects once the person is no longer here. But spiritual speaking, the spiritual root for this phenomenon is this idea, the fact that a person's positive qualities are revealed and intensified beginning at the moment of passing. Clearly, however, that's for the soul. For the individuals experiencing the passing of a loved one, it's very hard to experience that deep, mystical, spiritual revelation. As a matter of fact, we do talk about that and experience it and relive it, the positive aspect of it, the spiritual side of it every year on the yard site. But at the moment of passing, it's a very difficult moment. It's the most difficult moment because it seems that the deceased has been disconnected from their loved ones. And that moment is actually has the potential to intensify those existing relationships. See, our relationships with people we love is really a spiritual relationship. When a parent sits down on the floor and plays with the child, is it the playing that's the relationship? Or is it this deep soul connection that a parent has with the child? And so be a parent playing with a child at 1 year old, shaking that rattle. Or as the child grows older, and now at 10 years old, the parent is playing board games with the child. And as the child becomes a teenager, it's a whole different ballgame. Each one of those ideas, it's not what's being done, it's not the action that's that connection, it's a deep soul connection which is limited to those limited physical actions. But that relationship has to grow with time. Imagine trying to entertain a 15-year-old shaking a little rattle. That doesn't express our love to a 15-year-old. On the contrary. So our relationship with our loved ones grows with time, and we have to understand that those relationships change. And so once the deceased, the soul moved on, our relationship takes a much deeper turn. It's now solely and purely this soul connection, which is deeper than it ever was. Which leads us to those who are left behind. The moment of passing can be very difficult for the individual who is passing, for the dying person, which is why modern psychology and medical care, end-of-life medical care, and we're not going to get into it, it's not the topic of the class, but just to include it, is give some basic points. And that is that at that moment, those last few moments of life, to put the person at ease, to usher in a more relaxing atmosphere, it's good to reminisce about good memories, positive times, to talk to the individual, even if they aren't communicating, but they hear everything. The soul is still intact. They're entirely alive. They hear everything we're talking about, and so talk about only positive things, good memories. to have physical contact with your loved one, hold their hands, or whatever else is possible. Sometimes just being there in person, or unfortunately, as it is now in the past year, being there even on Zoom or talking to them through Zoom, knowing that they're cared for. And some actually suggest to have calming music, which helps for a comforting atmosphere. Now, based on what we've discussed in the past, last class, and now that the soul is entirely free, that may give us the understanding that the soul is happy. The soul is happy to move on, to be free from its shackles of them being tethered to the body. The soul is now excited to move on to the next experience. Yet, the Zohar tells us differently. The Zohar, text 2, page 47, the Zohar tells us as follows. Nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body. It's hard, it's tough, it's not easy. Why isn't it easy? There are 3 reasons. It's not easy because it's a transition. And anyone who has a toddler or ever brought a toddler to preschool knows transitions are not easy. And we have gone through transitions and they aren't easy. Be it a transition at work, moving, whatever type of transition it may be, transitions are tough. And for the souls being accustomed to being in the body, it's a tough transition. The soul doesn't want to leave the body. It doesn't want to go through a transition. It doesn't want to move. It doesn't want to move on to a new place. It wants to stay put where it is. Secondly, and maybe more importantly, the soul knows that being in a physical body, it's enabled to do mitzvahs, commandments. It's able to fulfill its mission, to make a difference, the world of action, to do something. As we spoke last week, the story of Rabbi Judah, who was crying at his deathbed. And he was asked, why are you crying? And he explained, because I'm leaving the world of action. I'm leaving the world where I can make a difference. I will no longer be able to make a difference. And so the soul sees it as a tough thing. It doesn't want to leave. It doesn't want to leave the world of action. It's hard for the soul. And finally, and maybe most importantly, in relation to tonight's class, is the idea that the soul has become intertwined with the body. See, the soul was sent to this world on a mission. In order to accomplish this mission, the soul and body had to be intertwined, and they had to integrate, accept each other, work with each other, and they forged this deep bond. To separate that bond is toughest on the soul. It may be that the soul is moving on to a more spiritual place. It may be that the soul is now able to set itself free, but it's not easy, and the soul doesn't leave easy. To the extent that this really affects what happens following the moment of passing. You see, we're familiar with the concept of Shiva. What we may not be familiar with is why. And within Shiva itself, and within the mourning process itself, which we'll get to a greater detail from the mourner's perspective next week, now we're going to look at it from the soul's perspective. It's associated with this tough decision to leave. As we'll see in text 3 on page 49, the Talmud says as follows, a Jerusalemite Talmud. For 3 days, the soul hovers above the body, thinking that it can return to it. After 3 days, when it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs. This is counterintuitive because we think that the soul would fly. It's ready to go. It's free. But as we just explained, the soul doesn't want to leave its body. The soul hovers above the body for 3 days. Maybe there's a chance it can be reconnected with its body. Maybe there's a chance it can be back into the world fulfilling the commandments. And it stays there until it sees that the body has changed. The body was so precious to the soul, so integral to its mission, that the soul is forever grateful and attached to the body and has trouble letting go. The soul doesn't want to abandon it. Now, so when does the soul leave? As a matter of fact, there are 4 stages of the soul's departure from the body. Shmuel, Ruben, would you like to read the next 3 texts, text 4a, 4b, and 4c? You'll have to unmute yourself first. We can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Thought I had, sorry.
There we go.
For 7 days, the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. After 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate, and the soul ascends to its place. For 30 days, the soul and the body are judged as one, and thus the soul is located down here on earth. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes in the earth. For 12 months, the body still exists, and the soul ascends and descends. After 12 months, the body becomes null, and the soul rises and no longer returns.
Thank you. So what we have here is continuing this idea that we expressed in text 3. And that is that there are 4 stages of the soul's departure from the body. There's the first 3 days when the soul hovers above the body. It yearns to return. It thinks that there's a chance it may be able to return. Following that, as we said in 4a, as Shmuel just read, the soul vacillates between the grave and its home. Goes back and forth, it comes back home, goes back to the grave, it comes back home. It's at a loss, it's looking for its home, it's looking for a place to be settled. Goes back to its body, goes back to its house, which incidentally is the reason why Shiva is supposed to be at the home of the deceased. Because we're there not only for the mourners, for the soul itself, which is there in the home that it lived in. It goes back and forth, vacillating between. And that's why we have Shiv, 7 days. Then there's the 30-day period. The third stage of the soul's departure from the body after the 7 days, the soul is still located on earth, as we read in 4b. And finally, we have the 12-month, where the soul vacillates between heaven and earth, going through its judgment period. Until finally, after 12 months, the soul settles. So there's this process of the departure of the soul from the body, which, as a matter of fact, this connection, these 4 levels is associated with 4 levels of mourning that we have here in this world, that the mourners have as they go through these periods. The same way we have these 4 periods of these stages of the soul's departure from the body, we have 4 stages of mourning. Text 5. Mourners observe 3 days of weeping, 7 days of eulogies, and for 30 days restrictions on haircuts and wearing freshly ironed clothing, marrying, joining a celebration of friends, and traveling on business. Text 6, page 53. If you encounter an acquaintance within 30 days of that person having lost a next of kin, offer words of consolation and avoid the customary pleasantries. If 30 days have elapsed since the relative's passing, greet your acquaintance in the usual manner and offer indirect words of consolation. Avoid mentioning the deceased by name and extend a generic consolation such as, may you be comforted. If your acquaintance is mourning the loss of a parent, you should offer direct messages of comfort for the first 12 months. And only after that, scale it back to indirect consolation. See, the Talmud and the Kabbalah above that we just read is teaching us that these 4 levels of the soul's departure from the body are matched with 4 levels of the mourner's grief and mourning over the passing of a loved one. The first 3 days, where the soul is still hovering over the body, are the most intense times because the soul is still here. And so we're mourning with the soul. Not just the mourners are mourning over their loss, they are mourning with the soul, being sad for the soul being in this uncertain position, hovering over its body. The subsequent days of Shiva, the first 7 days, when the soul is vacillating between the home and the grave, is now a time to focus on eulogies. In other words, to speak about the soul, its good qualities, because the soul is there. And again, we're mourning with the soul. We're trying to comfort the soul, how much good it did here on this world. And therefore, it's best to only talk positive about the soul during those 7 days. Following that, we have the 30-day period, and then the 12-month period. And again, the levels of mourning decrease as it goes along. Now, that's not to say that one can't cry after 3 days. Rather, that the focus is solely on the crying in the first 3 days. And the same with speaking about the qualities and eulogizing the deceased for the first 7 days. It can continue after. But the focus on those 7 days should be solely that. Because the soul is there with us. And so we are mourning not only the passing and the mourner's feelings, but we're comforting the soul as well. Which leads us to a perplexing story, which is related in the Talmud and Tractate Shabbos, page 54, text 7. Dr. Herman, would you like to read text 7?
Text 7. If a person dies and leaves no next of kin to be comforted, 10 people should go and sit in the deceased's home. A man died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood. As there were no mourners to be comforted, Rabbi Yehuda assembled 10 people every day, and they sat in the deceased's home. After 7 days, the dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, "May your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest."
So thank you. So if Shiva is merely for the mourners and for them to express their grief and their pain and their sadness, then why would Rabbi Yehuda gather 10 people and bring them to the home? Why would Rabbi Yehuda care for that? And not only that, even deeper, why would Rabbi Yehuda have a visit from the deceased thanking him for putting his soul at rest? But that's exactly the idea. Shiva is not only for the mourners, but it's also for the soul. It's to comfort the soul on its journey out of this world. The soul is troubled by its leaving. It wants to stay here. It's confused. And so we comfort the soul on its stages of departing this world, which explains a nuance within the statement which is said in the house of a mourner. The statement begins, Hamakom yenachem etchem. Some of you may have heard that statement before. May the omnipresent comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. That's what we tell the mourners. But notice the nuance in the word. In Hebrew, the word you in singular would be otcha. Hamakom yenachem otcha. May the omnipresent comfort you, singular. But instead, the statement is Hamakom yenachem etchem. Etchem is the plural of you. Say there's only one mourner, we still say the plural of you. Why are we saying the plural? We're saying the plural because we're comforting not only the mourner, we're also comforting the soul. So when we say that statement, we're comforting not just the mourner, but also the soul. And that's what we're doing during those 4 periods of mourning, is not only mourning for the soul, but not only mourning with the soul and with the mourners, but mourning for the soul and for its tough period of transition. Which brings us to this idea. Before we move on, we'll stop for some questions. If there are any questions, put them in the chat box. Let's see. Do some souls have an easier time leaving the body than others? If so, what are the conditions for this? That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I'd suggest, based on the text that we do have here, that there isn't a difference between souls. All souls have a tough time leaving this world for all three of those reasons. And I don't see a reason to make a differentiation between the three. Is the comforting text in the comforting statement in the text? It is not. If you like the comforting text, you can send me a message and I'll send it to you after. Thank you for that. Which leads us to the next step in the soul's journey. Because now, if we're putting so much focus on the soul, how about the body? How does that fit into the soul's immortality, the soul's holiness, and the comforting of the soul and its deep connection with the body? And that brings us to the funeral. You see, is anyone familiar with, you can unmute yourself if you do, with the Hebrew word for a funeral? Anyone? Does anyone know the Hebrew word for?
Levaya.
Thank you. Levaya, that's right. The Hebrew word for a funeral is levaya. Levaya literally means escort. To escort the dead. Halvaya tamet. To escort. Doesn't mean funeral. Why to escort? In Western culture, the idea of a funeral is going to a ceremony. We go to a ceremony, we hear some eulogies, say some prayers, and then when the ceremony's over, everyone leaves and the hearse leaves. That's a funeral. In Jewish tradition, that's not a funeral at all. As a matter of fact, in days of old and in many communities still today, there are no eulogies. There is no ceremony. There's just the escorting of the deceased to their final resting place, because the soul is there with us. And we'd like to show the soul its final respects of escorting it till its final resting place, which was why the mitzvah of escorting the deceased is to walk with the hearse, with the casket, with the deceased, until its final resting place in the cemetery. If one can't make it to the cemetery, second best is to escort it just a few feet, 6 feet, 4 cubits. If one isn't able to do that, then it's to escort it spiritually. At that time of escorting, at the time that the soul the deceased is being moved to the cemetery, to be there spiritually, to say some prayers. As was done in this past year, if we weren't able to be there, we were there on Zoom watching. It's important to be there in any way that we possibly can. And the soul knows that we are there, it sees that we are there, and it appreciates it. It appreciates us comforting it on its final journey. Which leads us to this next topic, the interment of the deceased and the care of the deceased in the time that precedes the funeral. What does Judaism say about the importance of the body now that the soul has, for the most part, departed it? And so we'll begin with text 8a, which gives us a stunning comparison with the holiest object in Judaism. Page 55. Quote from the Talmud, and we'll follow it with text 8b from Nachmanides. The Talmud tells us one who is present at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing. Not only family, the Talmud is telling us. Anyone who is there at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing. This is because a person's passing is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll. The law is that when a Torah scroll is burnt, God forbid, anyone who witnesses that has to tear their garments. And the Talmud tells us that a person's passing merits the same reaction from everyone that's there, even if they aren't family, even if they aren't the next of kin. What's this comparison between a person and a Torah scroll? Granted, the vague, they're both holy, so they both merit the same reaction. But really, is there something deeper? And so in text 8b, Nachmanides gives us some insight. Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked into a Torah scroll's parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body. The body of a Jew is analogous to the parchment of a Torah scroll. Just as a Torah scroll begins as hide from an animal, it could be turned into shoes. It's something which is lifeless from a spiritual perspective. It's something which is materialistic. So to a person, it's just flesh and bones. It's physical. It's materialistic. But following that, in the body, the soul is infused. Just like by a Torah scroll, where God's names are now inscribed upon it. Which leads us to, just as a scroll, the parchment has now become holy. A Torah scroll is the holiest object, and we all know it. We treat it with the utmost respect. In every single step of its life, we have to stand when it passes. We're not allowed to talk mundane discussions in front of it. So too the body itself. Once it had the soul in it, even if the soul has since departed, the body has become a holy object. The body is of absolute holiness. It's just like a Torah scroll. Which is why in Jewish tradition, text 9, in Jewish law, all who tend to a corpse must be aware that they are handling a holy entity. The human body is more than simply a sheath to a sacred entity, a tool that serves a supernal soul. Rather, it has itself become sanctified with an independent holiness similar to a Torah scroll. The underlying principle guiding the care afforded to the deceased is the immense sensitivity we have to a Torah scroll. Equal sensitivity must be given to the deceased, which is why in every Jewish community we have the Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Burial Society. And this Holy Burial Society, and here in Los Angeles we have it as well, once one passes, they understand the sanctity of the deceased, and they now treat the body with the utmost respect, sensitivity, and holiness that it deserves. When they prepare the body for holiness, for burial, the body is handled with respect and dignity. It's clean and dressed in shrouds. There's never any casual conversation permitted around the deceased. We don't say, hey, it's just, this is our job, or God forbid, the body, it's just the body, God forbid. The soul is there, the body is holy. We have to treat it as such, just like a Torah scroll. It's kept covered at all times, and it's never placed face down. And one final important point is that it's always guarded. And what do we mean by that? It's given an honor guard, in Hebrew called shmira. From the moment of death, the moment of one's passing, until the body is buried, it's never left alone. It has a Jew who is standing guard, even if it's on Shabbos or a Jewish holiday, who's sitting there, ideally saying Psalms or any other words of prayer, but if not, just sitting there quietly, usually in a room immediately adjacent to the body, and is kept company by this honor guard until the moment of burial. Kabbalistically speaking, it explains that because the body at this time has a tremendous level of holiness, there are the klipot, the impure spirits who try to jump in and take away some of that holy aspect of it. And so by a Jew being there, just the presence of a Jew, live Jew, it wards off those evil spirits, those impure spirits. On a practical level, it's an honor guard for something so holy, just as we don't leave a Torah scroll unguarded if it's out of its ark. And that's actually Jewish law. As you see in text 10, Cheryl, would you like to read text 10 on page 58? You have to unmute.
Okay,
There we
can you
go.
hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, page 58. We are required to maintain constant watch over a corpse, even during the daytime, and even if there is no cause to suspect that something can happen to the body. Those who maintain watch are actively performing a mitzvah to the extent that they are meanwhile absolved from many other mitzvot, such as reading the Shema and reciting prayers at the appropriate times. We maintain a watch over the dead out of respect, for if we were to leave the body alone, it would appear as if we have abandoned it like a utensil that we no longer require.
Thank you. And so because of that holiness that the body in and of itself retains, just like a Torah scroll, every aspect of the body now has to be afforded that tremendous sensitivity and respect and given burial, which is why some of you may have seen the images or videos following terrorist attacks in Israel. And there are, aside from the first responders, there are these people who wear these yellow vests that say in big letters on the back, Zaka. What are these people, Zaka? They're not first responders in the traditional sense. They are there to ensure that every single one of the deceased is afforded this sensitivity and this proper care due to them and every aspect of them. Every single aspect of a Jewish body is wholly following its passing, and so be it bodily parts, skin, fluids, whatever it may be, has to be buried together with the deceased. Because all of it is part of that soul and that holy connection with the soul. No part, however small, is lost. And that's what they do. They can collect every single aspect, even if it's just drops of blood that may have been on a shirt or on something, has to be buried together with the individual. And just like a Torah scroll, as we see in text 11, page 60, there is no differentiation in reverential treatment between a complete Torah scroll and a single letter that has become detached from a Torah scroll. Similarly, it is forbidden to handle with disrespect even a single bone that has become detached from a sacred body that was created in God's image. And so even after one's passing, the body retains its special status as having been the garb for the soul, just like a Torah scroll, which even if it becomes invalid, even if it's just one small part of the Torah scroll, has to be treated with utmost respect. So too the body retains this residual holiness and has to be treated with the utmost dignity at this point. Which leads us to a very important topic in Judaism. And that is Jewish burial. You see, throughout the ages, Jews have risked their lives to ensure proper Kvurat Yisrael, Kever Yisrael, to be buried properly in a Jewish cemetery by Jews. Growing up in Crown Heights, there's a Jew, may he live and be well. His name is Shalom Ber Drizin. He's Russian. And when he was a teenager growing up in Russia, under the Soviet Union, obviously any Jewish practices weren't allowed, especially in public, especially for others. For yourself, you were allowed to do it. But for others, it was not allowed. And there was a time that there was a famine and there was a disease going around and Jews were dying left, right, and center. He and his buddies risked their lives at the young age of 15, 16, 17 to go ahead and give each one of these Jews proper Jewish burial, which otherwise wouldn't have happened. In the dead of night, they'd go out covering their faces in the cold Russian winters, gathering the deceased who have been placed just on the street because there was no burial that was permitted, Jewish burial, gathering them from various places and ensuring that they had proper Jewish burial. Even nowadays, Unfortunately, there are Jews who pass away in various circumstances, and governments, for various laws and rules that are put in place, sometimes hold back proper Jewish burial. Rabbis throughout the United States and the world have moved heaven and earth, almost literally, to employ every possible avenue to ensure that any Jew, whoever it may be, receives proper Jewish burial. Which brings us to the topic of burial versus cremation. And as an introduction, I'd like to mention that a person is only responsible for what they do knowingly. Obviously, if a person does something out of ignorance, he never knew it's a problem to be cremated, he never knew that it's a problem to have someone else cremated, then the topics discussed today, as we shall soon see, does not apply to them. Obviously, their soul is in heaven, and Kaddish is said, and we can talk about their soul, and they will merit the resurrection of the dead with the coming of Mashiach. What we're discussing here is people who are held accountable, or rather, the idea from a Jewish perspective, how we ought to behave and what we should know, what is the proper Jewish tradition and law. And we'll begin with text 12, which is a verse from Deuteronomy, which tells us very clearly that it's a mitzvah and it's an obligation to bury the dead. As the verse says, you shall surely bury him on the same day as his death. According to Jewish law, one who passes, it's imperative that the funeral take place the same day that the individual passed, not to leave the body overnight, again, out of respect of the soul who is now hovering over the body and is waiting for that burial to take place. The soul is in no man's land as long as the body isn't buried. And the body is being disgraced if it isn't going back to where it should be. According to Jewish law, it should take place in rare circumstances. Is the funeral pushed off for a different day? Unfortunately, if there are too many funerals in one day, in some instances, if children are out of town and we're waiting for only children, not grandchildren and not siblings and not friends or family to join, only children are out of town and can't be at the funeral, it is one of those exceptions for the funeral to be pushed to a latter day. But here we have it clearly, the verse in Deuteronomy, you shall surely bury him the same day. Which takes us to the next idea. And that is this idea that a person's body, a human being, is the custodian of their body. God has given us a gift. God has given us our body to fulfill our mission in this world. It's not ours, it's God's. He's giving it on loan to us. And the day arrives when we have to return it to him. He's the owner, we have to return it to him. How do we return it to him? We can't actually hand over our bodies to God. We return it to God, to the place from which God fashions the body. When God created Adam, the first human being, what did God say? What does it say in the verse? God created Adam from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. When God reclaims his breath of life, we ought to return the body to the ground, the place from which God created the first human being. And so the body came from earth. It's entrusted to us as a deposit. And following one's passing, the deposit must be returned to where it came from. Text 14, page 63. As it says in Genesis, for you are dust and you will return to dust. The body comes from the earth and it is entrusted as a deposit to the individual's care. Upon death, the deposit must be returned to the earth from where it came and buried there. Throughout history, the Torah enumerates many different episodes of burial. Avram, first Jew, went ahead and went great lengths to find a burial spot for his wife, Sarah. later finding the cave of Machpelah, and there burying his wife, and later to be buried was himself and his children and his grandchild Jacob and his wife, and so on. Yitzchak and Yishmael, Isaac and Yishmael, they went at great lengths to bury their father there. Jacob buried his wife Rachel at the place immediately where she passed in Bethlehem, where she's there till today. Jacob requested that at his passing, he shouldn't be in Egypt. Rather, his son Joseph, who was the viceroy, should take him up to Israel at the earliest possible immediately and bury him in Israel. And when it came to Moses' passing, and this might be an interesting metaphor that we can use for the past year, where many of people we know, our loved ones who have passed, and we're with a very small group of people who were there to ensure their final resting place and to be there with them for their final journey. Moses passed and didn't have much of a funeral. No one was there. He could have had a tremendous funeral. Moses, the greatest leader, but he didn't. Only God was there. And God ensured that he was buried, as the verse tells us in Deuteronomy. Which some suggest is because Moses knew that many generations, there will be many Jews who won't have anyone at their funeral. And so Moses was showing them, just as me, when I passed, the only one who was there was God. So too, any Jew who passes and there aren't any people to be there at his funeral, God is there, ensuring that he will have that final journey with God. And so throughout history, this traditional burial was always considered highest priority. And unfortunately, as the years passed and as we reached here in Western society, it has reached this point where cremation is being considered more and more. Back in the 60s, they say the National Foundation, the National Funeral Directors Association, according to their numbers, according to their statistics, only 3.6% of Americans opted for cremation. According to the NFDA's projection, by the year 2035, 78.8%, staggering number, will opt for cremation. Now, it's impossible to know how many Jews are part of that statistic and what number of Jews, but suffice it to say that the trend is growing, unfortunately, and many Jewish funeral homes have began offering that services in direct contradiction to Jewish law and Jewish tradition. And so it's important to know that according to Jewish law, cremation is prohibited. Even if the local so-called Jewish funeral homes offer it. Why is that? Why is Jewish burial so important as opposed to cremation? Burial serves as an affirmation of two fundamental Jewish beliefs. The first one being what we just mentioned, that the Jewish body isn't ours. It's given on loan to us by God. And so God, the owner, is the one who dictates where we return it. And God has dictated to us that we have to return it to dust, to bury it in the ground. If we take something on loan from someone, we don't get to decide where we give it back to them, how we give it back to them. The owner does. And God has dictated to us that we have to return it in that manner of Jewish burial. Second, and a deeper concept, is the fundamental belief as expressed by Maimonides in the 13 attributes of faith. The belief of the resurrection of the dead, which will occur sometime after the ultimate redemption. This firm belief, may it come speedily in our days, has sustained our nation throughout 2,000 years plus of exile, which we've had pogroms, expulsion, persecution, genocide, and whatnot. Belief in the resurrection of the dead is synonymous with the enduring value of the sanctity of the body. Because when we destroy the body through cremation, we are destroying it and showing our implied not believing in the resurrection of the dead, which is a fundamental tenet of Judaism. Burying the body intact is an affirmation of this belief. Cremation is a rejection of God's ownership of the body, because God says one thing and I'm going to do something else. In other words, I don't believe that the body belongs to God. And it's going against this fundamental principle of the resurrection of the dead. And so, even if throughout one's lifetime we say, you know what, I didn't fulfill this commandment, I didn't fulfill the other commandment, there's various things that I didn't do. So this is another thing that I won't do. This isn't just another prohibition. This is something which is associated with some of Judaism's core belief, and it constitutes a permanent and irrevocable statement. Therefore, someone who is lax in other areas, when it comes to this, it's an absolute importance to ensure the proper burial of the Jewish body. Now, when it comes to cremation, some people say, you know what? They're worried about ecological issues, worried about utilizing much needed land improperly. But the reality is, when it comes to burial versus cremation, cremation damages the ecological system worse than burial will ever. When the cremation process, when a body is being burnt in a crematorium, it releases the gases from the fire, as well as the smoke, which releases carcinogenic material into the atmosphere, and it uses much more energy than burial does. And as a matter of fact, there's a growing trend of green burials nowadays, where the advertisements for green burials, it's simple and natural, it's green burials, it's a biodegradable casket, simple shroud, no embalming fluids, no concrete vaults. Jewish burial, we've been doing this for decades. We've been preserving the earth for thousands of years following a simple Jewish traditional burial. As a matter of fact, there's once again a Jewish, so-called Jewish funeral home in Long Island that on their website, they explain these differences. And they say, look, it's the growing trend, so we'll do it, unfortunately, even though it's against Jewish law. But they strongly consider that these individuals should reconsider it because, A, the cost to the environment is much greater with a cremation than with burial, as well as if it's financial consideration. Every single Jewish burial society will never turn someone away due to lack of funds. Every burial society, every Chabad house, every Orthodox synagogue will never, ever turn someone away, will ensure that every single person will receive the right to a proper Jewish burial, regardless of funds. Which leads us to an important point, and that is this idea of, once again, it's a sensitive topic. It's important to note that there's a difference between someone who was cremated because they did not know better. They were somewhat ignorant. They were super affected by their atmosphere and by others who kind of imposed it upon them and gave them a false belief that it is permitted for whatever reason, versus someone who knowingly chooses cremation. The Mishnah tells us that someone who chooses cremation, or rather begin a step further, the Mishnah, the Talmud tells us that those who do not believe in the resurrection of the dead will actually not merit that their souls will be resurrected in their own bodies. And so, we don't burn something that we expect to use another time. We don't go ahead and burn it. When someone goes ahead and does cremation, it's a de facto not believing in the resurrection of the dead. And once again, according to the Mishnah, someone who doesn't believe in the resurrection of the dead will not be resurrected in their body. And so if someone consciously, with full knowledge, goes ahead and chooses cremation, according to many halachic authorities, that person is subject to the consequence outlined in the Mishnah for those who don't agree with the resurrection of the dead. As a matter of fact, our sages instituted deterrents to ensure that this doesn't happen. And so ashes are not allowed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Not only that, the family doesn't sit Shiva. And there's a very powerful letter. If you remind me after the class, I'll send it to you. A powerful letter of a Chabad rabbi whose father was an atheist and insisted on cremation. And it's a painful letter, an open letter to his father saying that don't do cremation, not for yourself, at least for me, so I can sit Shiva, so I can go through that mourning process, because someone whose loved one is cremated out of choosing and out of knowing better, not out of ignorance, as we mentioned before, that in family doesn't sit Shiva. And even to say Kaddish, it's a debate amongst the sages. So what happens, you may say, that, you know what? Granted, I feel it's important to ensure that in my will, I'll make sure that my children know that I want proper Jewish burial. I'll buy a plot, as our sages say, that buying a plot is actually a good omen for long life. Writing a will is a good omen for long life. But what happens if we have a loved one who is written into their will and they pass, and in their will it says that they want to be cremated? Don't we have to follow the last will, the last, whatever the deceased would like? What should we do in such a case? And as a matter of fact, it's actually Jewish law. As we say in text 15, the final wishes of someone, page 64, it is a mitzvah to implement the expressed final wishes of the deceased. And so it's understandable that a family would be reluctant to contravene the express will of their beloved deceased. However, Maimonides explains succinctly in his book of laws that although it's a mitzvah to implement the expressed wishes of the deceased, text 15b, if a person requested not to be buried, we disregard the request. This is because burial is a mitzvah, as it is stated, you shall surely bury him. As explained earlier, a person's body is not theirs. If it's not theirs, just as a person who would write in their will, I want after my passing, my children should burn down the neighbor's house. We don't say, look, we have to follow the expressed wishes of a deceased, so we're going to go burn down our neighbor's house. It's not his, he doesn't have control over it. So too regarding a person's body, it's not his, it's God's. And so if they go right against an explicit commandment, we don't listen. As the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud actually spells out quite clearly. It says we have to follow the express wishes of the deceased, but if it goes against a mitzvah, we do not follow it. For example, the Talmud says, if he says that I want to give half my inheritance to so-and-so, we have to follow his wish. But if he says, I'd like to be cremated, the Talmud says this very clearly. I'd like to be cremated, we do not listen. Just as a person during their lifetime, according to Jewish law, he can't say, I want you to hit me. According to Jewish law, we're not allowed to give our bodies up for being hurt. Which, parenthetically, the Merchant of Venice, with depicting Shylock, is a great 20th century sage who dissects the story and analyzes it from a Jewish legal position and explains how Shylock was actually acting from the local culture, non-Jewish culture, which put him into such a position, demanding such a situation, such a payment. But according to Jewish law, that would never hold, even if it's a signed contract, because a Jew is not allowed to cause their body to be hurt, because the body does not belong to them. It's in the code of Jewish law. We can't say to someone else, give me a punch. I want you to cut my finger. I want you to do something to me that'll cause me hurt, because our bodies aren't ours. So too when it comes to cremation, but it's even deeper than that. You see, the soul, once it's on high, it's now in the world of truth, in the world of spirituality. And it knows that what it truly wants is to be buried a proper Jewish burial. So as a matter of fact, by going against its will in its last will, at this moment, what is the soul's wish? The soul's wish is for us to disregard what they've written about that and to give them a proper Jewish burial. And it's safe to assume that the deceased soul will bring heavenly mercy and blessings upon the individuals that ensure that the body was accorded its final proper respects in the manner of a Jewish burial. And I'd just like to mention address a common misconception and really a myth, and I hear it many times, and that is regarding tattoos. It is a prohibition to receive a tattoo according to Jewish law, and it's for the same reason: the sanctity of the body, the fact that the body doesn't belong to us. But a body that is tattooed can be buried in a Jewish cemetery, no problems whatsoever. There isn't anywhere in any Jewish opinion that a tattooed Jew cannot be buried in a Jewish burial. You can't find it. It's a myth. I'm not sure where it came from. It may have come from certain burial societies being uncomfortable with it because other people may have complained, I don't want to be buried next to someone who has a tattoo, because it's a blatant disregard for Jewish tradition. I don't know. That may have become the norm and the accepted understanding that it's prohibited to bury a tattooed person in a Jewish cemetery. That isn't true. It's permissible. It's done. As a matter of fact, removing the tattoo isn't a prerequisite. Removing the tattoo even during one's lifetime, if they got the tattoo before they knew that it was wrong, it's not necessary to remove it. It's ideal if it's possible, if it's cheap, but if it isn't, it's totally fine. And so it's important to know that, and other myths that we may have heard throughout our lifetime from various things, they are untrue. And so to afford the person their final respects, final proper, ensure that we give them a proper Jewish burial. The interment of the soul doesn't spell the end for our connection with the soul, for our connection with the physical remains of our loved ones who have passed on. Which brings us to another meaningful Jewish practice associated with those who have moved on, visiting the resting place. Visiting the resting place serves three aspects. First one is it's respect for the departed, that they know that people are visiting. As we mentioned earlier, there's an aspect of the soul, as we mentioned right in the onset there from the letter of the Alter Rebbe. There is a part of the soul, the nefesh, that remains in the body during that first 3 days, following that the 7 days, the 30 days, and the full 12 months. But even after the 12 months, when even the nefesh, the higher components of that nefesh, ascends on high, the lower component of the nefesh of the soul, the lowest aspect of the soul, remains with the body for eternity. And so the soul is there. And the soul knows when we arrive to visit the grave, it understands us, it feels us, it connects with us, and it appreciates our visit. Which is why, as the Zohar tells us, page 66, text 16, the nefesh remains present in the grave. Due to the fact that it remains among the living, it is acquainted with their pain. At their time of need, it pleads with God for mercy on their behalf. When the inhabitants of the world are in need, when they are in sorrow and visit the cemetery, the nefesh is aroused to their plight. It ascends and awakens the ruach, which in turn entreats God for mercy. Consequently, the Holy One, blessed be He, has mercy on the world. So in other words, aside from the soul feeling respected and appreciating our visits to the grave sites of our loved ones, going to visit our parents, family member, or friends, they know that we're there, they appreciate it. It brings the soul consolation. It understands why we are there. It knows that it hasn't been forgotten. It's also, as the Zohar just told us, it's this communication port to the more spiritual, lofty aspects of the soul. You see, when we come to the graveside of a loved one, and the loved one, the soul knows that we are there, and it sees that we're there and we're pained. We're coming to pray because we're going through a tough time in life or a happy time in life, and we come to let our loved ones know what's going on. They feel our pain, and they communicate to the greater aspects, the loftier aspects of their soul, which in turn intercede on our behalf before the Almighty. Which is why we go to pray at the gravesite of sages, of rabbis, and of our loved ones. Because they're on high and they have this deep connection. And they're able to intercede on our behalf. The nefesh is present among the living. It's there in the cemetery. It's there with us when we go and visit the gravesite. It then communicates. When it feels our pain, it communicates to the ruach, that more lofty associated with its feelings and its spirit, which then entreats to God on our behalf. That connection is deep. The love is there. The care and concern from our loved ones to us, even after their passing, at their graveside, where they feel us and they sense our visits, is there, and as mentioned in the beginning, stronger than before. Which explains a very perplexing story that happened in times of old, as expressed by the famous 12th century sage, Rabbi Yehuda the Pious. Text 17, page 67. There was once a community that wished to relocate. One of the deceased buried in the vicinity appeared in a dream to a member of the community and pleaded, "Please do not abandon us, for we appreciate your visits to our cemetery." Barzillai the Gileadite declared, "I would like to die in my own city." Why? He wished for this because the deceased appreciate when their loved ones visit their grave and request goodness for their souls. This improves their condition in heaven. And when we pray on behalf of the deceased, they pray for us in return. And so this should be no surprise to us that, considering that, as explained in the beginning of this lesson, our connection and bond of love continues after our loved one's passing. And this bond and connection is mutual. They appreciate our visit. The connection is mutual. And that's why, especially on special days, just before Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, on birthdays, on yahrzeits, it's next to a holiday, it's customary to visit the gravesite. Much of today's lesson was devoted to the soul's departure from this world and the continuing relationship it has with the people it leaves behind. I'd like to conclude today with a very powerful excerpt from a letter that the Rebbe wrote in 1958 to a Mrs. Hannah Sharpstein, who was then a young woman who within a 5-year period lost her mother, her father, and her mother-in-law. Mrs. Sharpstein wrote an emotional letter to the Rebbe. She wrote many letters, but at that point in the moment, in 1958, she wrote an emotional letter to the Rebbe describing how she was feeling alone after losing so many of her loved ones. And the Rebbe responded as follows. Page 68, text 18. Laura, would you like to read it?
Okay. Blessing and greeting. I received your undated letters in which you write about your emotional upsets in connection with the passing of your mother and the questions which are troubling you in this connection, involving also questions in regard to the passing of your father. Peace unto them. Another fundamental point to remember, which has a direct bearing on your letter, is that all believers in God believe also in the survival of the soul. Actually, this principle has even been discovered in this physical world, where science now holds as an absolute truth that nothing in the physical world can be absolutely destroyed. How much more so in the spiritual world, especially in the case of the soul, which in no way can be affected by the death and disintegration of the physical body. It would be silly and illogical to assume that because a certain organ of the body ceases to function, affecting other physical organs of the body, the spiritual soul would also be affected thereby. The truth is that when the physical body ceases to function, the soul continues its existence, not only as before, but even on a higher level, inasmuch as it is no longer handicapped by the restraints of the physical frame. Thirdly, the attachment of children to their parents and the general attachment between close relatives during life on this earth is surely not a physical attachment by the respective physical bodies of the relatives. Essentially, the attachment is a spiritual one, due to the spiritual affinity between those concerned and the qualities of the soul, including such spiritual things as character, kindness, goodness, etc., all of which are attributes of the soul and not of the body. Therefore, also, every action on the part of a person in relation to a beloved person and the desire to benefit that person is not directed towards pleasing his physical body, his bones and tissue, for it is the spiritual pleasure that one is concerned with. In view of the above, it is clear that even after the physical body has disintegrated and disappeared from view, it is still possible to bring joy and benefit to the soul, which, as noted above, not only survives, but does so on a higher level, and all the things which had previously brought joy and pleasure to one's parents will continue to do so even after they are physically no longer here.
What a powerful letter. Thank you. Expressing this idea beautifully, that our connection with our loved ones not only is still there, not only do they feel us, not only do they hear our pain, do they sense and are joyous with our excitement, but it's deeper and greater than it ever was. A good idea would be to take a minute now, or 30 seconds, to think about one idea, one insight from this last lesson that resonated with you the most. And think about if there's a deceased person with whom you would wish to strengthen that bond with. What step can you take to do so? As we expressed in the first letter, the best way to connect with a person is to remember this idea that they're now spiritual. And it's specifically through love that we can strengthen that connection that we have.
Lesson 2. Taking Leave. 1. Nefesh and Ruach are two of the soul's components. After death, the Nefesh remains with the body, while the Ruach disengages and ascends to Gan Eden. No longer. Lesson 2. Taking Leave. 1. Nefesh and Ruach are two of the soul's components. After death, the Nefesh remains with the body, while the Ruach disengages and ascends to Gan Eden, paradise. 2. Once the Ruach is no longer limited to material existence, it's more accessible to all who wish to connect to it. Thus, when a person dies, our ability to spiritually connect with him or her is stronger and deeper than before. 3. Though the Nefesh remains in the grave, it retains a connection with the higher levels of the soul. The gravesite is thus a portal where we can communicate with departed souls and ask them to intercede before God on our behalf. 4. Over the course of a lifetime, the soul and body integrate and bond. Their separation at death is therefore painful for the soul. 5. the soul departs the body in stages. These stages correspond to the prescribed periods of mourning. When we mourn, we are mourning not only for the deceased, but also with the deceased. 6. Dignity and sensitivity are the underlying principles that guide the care of a corpse and its preparation for burial. This is because even after death, the body retains its special status of having been the container for the soul. 7. Burial is of highest priority in Jewish tradition and culture. When God takes a person's soul, we are tasked to return the body to the place from which God fashioned it. 8. Burial affirms two fundamental Jewish beliefs. A. Our bodies aren't ours. They belong to God. And B. There will be a resurrection of the dead in the Messianic era.
Thank you all for joining for this week's class. Next week, we will discuss the people left behind, the mourners who are left heartbroken and devastated. What's the Jewish grieving process? What's the significance of various traditions? And we'll try to give a meaningful Jewish perspective on grief, as well as practical etiquette during Shiva for the mourners and for those who come to visit them and everything associated with that. I'd like to conclude with the famous verse from Isaiah that we should merit to usher in the era of death shall be swallowed up forever, and God shall wipe the tears away from every face with the coming of Mashiach. May it be speedily in our days.